Alright, so you probably noticed there's something different about this video. I decided to emulate what my aura looked like to me the first time I saw it using After Effects. And it leads into the subject of this video, which is to tell my story in a nutshell. How I came to be on a conscious spiritual path, how I found out I was an Indigo, and some of the significant events that has led me to the present moment. So I'll start by kind of revealing, my childhood. I grew up Catholic, and although I don't consider myself Catholic now, I just consider myself spiritual. I didn't go to Catholic school, so when you're, if you are familiar, if you're not going to school, then you go to what's called CCD, which is like a Bible study class once a week. Kind of keeps you active in the church and meeting with other kids in the church and things. And I didn't really consider myself to be that interested, honestly. Like, the reason why I went to CCD class, or the reason why I like to go, is because there was a girl that I had a crush on, and we would hang out, and I was always really excited to see her. So the nights that she didn't show up or was absent, I just felt like my time was wasted. Not to say that there weren't significant events that happened. A couple of the lock-ins were, very emotional and profound. But the most significant event at that time was the night of my confirmation. So after you go to CCD, then you go to a confirmation class as you get older. And that kind of is designed to confirm you into the Catholic faith for good, right? Hoping you'll stay with that church. And the instructor was a lady who lived down the street who I hung out with her son every once in a while. And on the night of my confirmation, we were all led into a room, and there was a basket of scrolls on a table and an altar on the side. And we were told to, pray for a gift that we felt wasn't given to us at birth. And so I went last, or second to last at least, because I really didn't know what to ask for. So when I knelt down, it just came to me, to pray for understanding. And so I did, and I got up and I picked my scroll, and I opened it up, and it was understanding. And I thought that was like little, like, woo, like, ooh, that's interesting and weird, but I didn't really think much of it until later. So I didn't really go to church, honestly, after that. I'd go, I ended up going to school in Boise, Boise State after that, and I would go home and I'd visit, and go to church then and things, but I didn't really consider myself, I didn't really agree with all of the dogma related to the church. And I wasn't really even interested in that at that time. So after I'd gone to Boise, I didn't really think much of religion at all, honestly. I didn't go to church there, and it wasn't until I was just about to leave Boise, and I kind of was hanging out with a couple people, and this girl gave me the book Celestine Prophecy. And I read that, and it was just really intriguing to me. And so, I found myself going to the park and trying to see, the trees around auras, or the auras around trees. And, a lot of weird synchronistic events happened related to that book. And so I ended up leaving Boise and going back to Idaho Falls and finishing school in Pocatello, Idaho, which is, I'm from southeast Idaho. And coincidentally, the girl who I was, had a crush on in CCD class was the chief editor of the newspaper, and I ended up working on the paper doing the music reviews. And around that time, I'd also, I was in the rave scene, a very, beautiful community at that time. It was the height of the rave scene. The amount of freedom and expression and, non-judgment, and, it was just so important, in my opinion, in my spiritual development, because of how open and loving people were at that time. It wasn't a meat market type of situation, and it was new. It was this new thing. So that's when I got into liquid dancing. I may do a video just showing you what liquid dancing is, or at least me. I don't know. Might as well. Dancing's fun, right? So yeah. So at the same time, I started hanging out with this guy named Brian, who I considered to be one of my spiritual teachers, right? It seemed like, he had a lot of good things to say, and I had a lot of questions that were starting to formulate, and I liked, the things that he had to say about them. And so, he was giving me a few books, and I started reading a lot. And one book in particular he gave me was called Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh. And that was around the time that synchronicity just came every moment. And I was going to school at the time, and things were happening so synchronistically. Every single person was leading me to something, and I was helping people, and I felt like my intelligence just increased so much. I mean, things made so much more sense. I was taking a lot of like psychology and philosophy and science. It all just started to make so much more sense. I was, a B student, and I went, to an A student overnight. Except, there was this one class I was in, which was communications, and Southeast Idaho, mind you, is primarily Mormon. I don't know if anybody knows that. So being a non-Mormon in a very religiously oppressed area, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with whatever religion you choose to be, but when you get a lot of people that are like-minded and in one area, then there tends to be a lot of favoritism and a lot of elitism, and that just leads to a lot of negative behavior, in my opinion. So I ended up, being in my communications class, and the first day, my professor, Leslie Leak, asked us all to, describe ourselves and say a little bit about our hobbies or interests. Of course, everyone in the class was Mormon, so they're like, oh, I'm part of board, blah, 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 and I go to church here, and this and that. Just everything was about church. And I was just like, well, I'm really into music, and I'm not religious. I used to be Catholic, but I consider myself spiritual at this time. And I noticed that she took interest in that. And when it came around to her, she said the same thing. And I didn't really think much of it, but at the height of my spiritual awakening process, and an awakening, if you're not familiar with that term, and I didn't really know what it was until long after, but it's when the conscious construct becomes self-evident, when your awareness of source becomes self-evident, and the proof becomes it's without a doubt. It was shown to me so many times over during that period of time that there is no possible way I could believe in coincidence ever again. So one day during this time also I felt a little crazy, because again, I'm surrounded by people who are religious who don't necessarily believe that a person has any right to knowledge of the universe or God or conscious construct is my favorite term, unless you're going to church and you are a particular religion. So my ideas weren't welcomed at the time. So I felt a little crazy and a little alone, and very busy, because I was doing a lot of projects and helping people, and just being wrapped up in this beautiful new epiphany and awareness. And this one particular speech, I just did not put any work into. To be honest, I didn't even put an hour's probably worth of work into it. And when Mrs. Leak handed it back. She handed it back to me, face down, and she looked kind of, distraught about that, like feeling really guilty. And so I turned the paper over and it was a C. And I was like, that's awesome. There's no way I deserve a C. Like, I didn't put any time into that at all. So, but she was really, she looked like very, very sad about it. So, it was heartbreaking for me at the time. So I ended up, deciding that I wanted to go speak with her after class. And, what transpired after that, it was another major significant event that happened to me, and I'll continue that in part 2.